Welcome to a review of Homoeoprophylaxis, or as some call it, homeopathic immunisation. This little chat is not meant to make you an expert in homeoprophylaxis, but really to give an overview, as well as, for those of you who are experienced in the method, some of the latest data that I have. So basically, Dr. Schulper suggested doing this recording and has suggested some things to ask and some outlines to follow. So what we're going to do is talk about what is homeoprophylaxis, why do CAM practitioners need to know about it. Very briefly, the story of how I started using it, then what will be of interest to many of you, the latest statistics and evidence. So what is homeoprophylaxis? I define it as the systematic use of potentized substances to prevent the development of the characteristic symptoms of targeted infectious diseases. Now, you can see those two words that are underlined, systematic. This is not some random selection of remedies. The selection of remedies is done according to the principle of similars, and the administration of the remedies is done according to the principle of minimum dose. So homeoprophylaxis programs, if they're done properly, are carefully constructed and are constructed in the way they are for a reason. And secondly, the word characteristic is underlined because unlike homeopathic treatment, where you actually need to look for the peculiar individual symptoms of each person with a particular condition, whatever the condition may be, as Kent said, prevention is easier than treatment, because what we have to do with prevention is find remedies that are similar to the characteristic symptoms of the diseases that we have to prevent. Now, in some diseases, this is easier than with others. But it's a great advantage because if strains of diseases change over time, provided the characteristic symptoms of the disease don't change, then the same remedy will be similar and therefore effective. A great example of this is whooping cough. We know that in countries like America and Australia, there's been a big increase in outbreaks of whooping cough. And this is not because fewer people are being vaccinated against it. In fact, that's the opposite is happening, certainly in Australia. It's because the strain of whooping cough in the community has changed. And as you know, with vaccination, there needs to be a lock and key almost matching of the antigen in the vaccine and the antigen in the community. And as that matching weakens, as new strains develop, then the vaccine becomes less effective. And that's certainly what has happened. The standard whooping cough vaccine has become significantly less effective. It probably used to be up to maybe 85%, being generous. It's probably now around 60%, maybe 65%. The advantage we have with homeoprophylaxis is that if the strains of whooping cough change, but the symptom profile of whooping cough remains very similar, the same remedies will still work. And of course, we have the opportunity to make nosodes from the new strains. So that's my simple definition of what homeoprophylaxis is. Remembering that the remedies are chosen and the frequency, the potency is chosen for very specific reasons. So Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathic medicine, first used homeoprophylaxis to prevent scarlet fever in 1798. He was treating scarlet fever at the time with the remedy belladonna, and he also used the remedy belladonna to prevent. and this was an example of a genus epidemicus remedy as opposed to a nosode, which is a remedy prepared from the diseased organism itself. And he later gave directions as to how to prevent cholera and hydrophobia, but it was used also by the old masters of homeopathy, von Bonninghausen, Burnet, Kent, Close, and then modern day Shepherd, Blackie, Isiaga. So this is something which both the founder and the great old masters of homeopathy used. And they didn't use it because it wasn't homeopathic, they used it because it was homeopathic. And it provided protection safely with a relatively high degree of effectiveness. Very briefly, the story of how I first started. Well, I first started practice in 1984, and prior to that, before I knew what homeopathy was, I used to vaccinate my children. One of them was vaccine damaged. I won't go into that story, that's her story, not mine, but it certainly had a big impact on me. When I then started studying natural medicine and came across homeopathy, I fell in love with it. It fitted very much with my own, if you like, esoteric studies at the time. And I was amazed to find when I started to read Hahnemann's lesser writings that he had used homeoprophylaxis to prevent scarlet fever. And then I searched a bit further and found that other, not only the masters, but other numerous practitioners used homeopathy to prevent different infectious diseases in different countries around the world. And so basically when I started practicing homeopathy and realised this, I thought, well, this was an option that I would have loved to have known about before I vaccinated my own children at the time. From then on, I'd stopped vaccinating, and in 1985 I developed my first program of homeoprophylaxis, and of course my own children started using it then, and many of my grandchildren have used it since. So I'm happy to practice what I preach when it comes to homeoprophylaxis, but I started offering programs to the community. They changed over time. When I first started in 1985, I mimicked the orthodox vaccination schedule, which of course was a fraction of what the vaccination schedule is today. I have changed that over time, and this is one of the things we talk about in the course, how my program has changed over time. These days I don't try and mimic the orthodox vaccination schedule, which includes so many doses for so many different diseases, some of which are very mild diseases in healthy children. These days I focus on immunising in what I call the main program against the most potentially serious diseases, but give parents the option with what I call the supplementary program, and outside of that, because that doesn't cover every disease for which there's a vaccine either. It's the parents' option, I believe, to choose eventually what diseases they cover their children for. It's not my decision. I'm here to help. And to me, that's my purpose. I'm not anti-vaccination. I believe that vaccination and homeoprophylaxis should exist side by side in communities. I also believe that if the orthodox health authorities in most communities were open to research and evidence, that they would permit vaccination and homeoprophylaxis to exist side by side, and let parents choose. Give them truthful, factual information and let them choose. It should be the parents' choice. It shouldn't be made by representatives of pharmaceutical companies or homeopathic companies. Okay, so let's look at some of the latest statistics that I've been gathering. Now, some years ago I was challenged by a naturopath in Sydney who made a big statement on a closed naturopathic group that there was no evidence, no substantial evidence supporting homeoprophylaxis. And of course that was not true, but I thought, well, I'll start a process of clearly demonstrating that what he said was incorrect. And so I, some couple of years ago, had published in the Australian homeopathic journal Similia, which is the journal of the Australian Homeopathic Association, a study talking about the use of HP in 3 countries in 91 million people on an annualised basis. And after my visit to India last year, I've made 4 visits to Cuba, and last year was my 4th visit to India, collecting data, working with the people using these homeoprophylaxis programs in those countries. I've upgraded that, and I've recently had the material published in an American journal, Journal of the American Institute of Homeopathy, I believe it is, which talks about the use in 250 million people on an annualised basis. So you can see from this table, I've looked at 3 countries, Cuba, India and Brazil. I've looked at 6 HP programs, some of which were a once-off, some of which went over a number of years, and we'll talk certainly about that. And the programs by years, for example, the final Brazilian program, which ran from 2007 to 2012, is counted as 6 years. So there were 34 years covered, and you can see the 25 million in Cuba, 224 million on an annualised basis, remember, in India, and 870,000 in Brazil, over 250 million people altogether. Just going through those 3 countries, and of course, you know, this is not an attempt to quantify every homeoprophylaxis intervention in the world. This is an attempt to give a summary to show people that this method is being used around the world, and in many cases, in these examples, by government agencies. So you can see the year, the disease. In Cuba we looked at leptospirosis, Hep A, dengue, swine flu, pneumococcal disease. And you can see government directed. All of those interventions in Cuba were directed by a government institute, in this case the Finlay Institute. I was first invited to Cuba in 2008 by the Finlay Institute, who are holding an international conference entitled Nosodes 2008. I had no idea the Cubans were doing this work, but they had actually used my work to determine the potencies for their interventions in 2007 and 2008 against leptospirosis, where they covered over 2 million people in each intervention. So I was invited there to speak at the conference, and I went back every second year for another 3 times. So I've been to Cuba 4 times. Unfortunately, in 2015, the wonderful president of the Finlay Institute, Dr. Concepcion Campa Huergo, everyone called her Conchita, ceased to be president, and that changed the whole use of homeoprophylaxis in Cuba. But up to that time, they were doing amazing work. It was so sad to hear that change. And Dr. Bracho, who was the vice president who led the interventions, he left Cuba soon after that, and he and I still do keep in touch from time to time. But the work that they were doing there was outstanding. And you can see they used a lot of nosodes, but they also used nosodes and genus epidemicus remedies mixed together. The Cubans are very inventive in that regard from a classical homeopathic perspective, and they don't mind combining remedies, which I tend not to do as being basically a classical homeopath, but it works. They've proven it works. Now, unfortunately, the effectiveness was not determined always by a measure of effectiveness, and those numbers B, D that you see down the side there are different forms of classification that I've put together in the article, and you'd need to read the whole article to understand all of that. But basically, when we're talking about B classification, it means that there is an indirect control group. So with the very large interventions against leptospirosis, they were undertaken in 3 of the provinces in Cuba, and we used the rest of the provinces in Cuba as an indirect control group. The results in 2007 were based really on a predictive model, but the results in 2008 weren't, and they were overwhelmingly convincing when one looked at the incidence of leptospirosis in the 2 different regions, the intervened 3 provinces and the other provinces in Cuba that weren't intervened. The intervened provinces were worst hit by hurricanes. The disease should have been significantly greater in those 3 provinces, and in fact it was substantially less, purely because of the homeopathic interventions. The classifications D there are talking more about the benefit from the interventions were arrived at by comparing historical trends. But certainly the intervention in 2010 against swine flu and pneumococcal disease was directed by the Cuban government. They told Finlay Institute, okay, swine flu was meant to be a problem. We want you to cover the whole population over 12 months of age, 9.8 million people, against swine flu. They also put in against pneumococcal disease, and there were hardly any cases of swine flu, but we could tell from the pneumococcal historical trends and the change in that year how effective it was. In India, you can see Japanese encephalitis, dengue. Sorry, the numbers after those names are references in my article. I forgot to remove them from this spreadsheet, but if you look at the article, you can see them. Chikungunya, epidemic fever, dengue again. And you can see the massive intervention against Japanese encephalitis, the 3rd row, which went over for children 14 years and younger, roughly 20 million children in Andhra Pradesh, and then when it split, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and that went from 1999 to 2009, the world's largest homeoprophylaxis intervention over, a substantial, over a decade. Some of the interventions we're able to quantify a figure, and some we weren't, and you can see the range 63.9 for epidemic fever, where there was a direct control group, up to 99.9 for Japanese encephalitis and dengue on the first 2 rows. In that very large intervention, we were looking at historical trends mainly once again, and that showed a dramatic reduction in the incidence of Japanese encephalitis in Andhra Pradesh when it was first used, from 1999 down to 2004 when there was nothing. So very strong positive results. And in Brazil, just going back, you can see the first 1974 in India, going back to the Indian situation, you can see that all of those except the 2006 chikungunya intervention were via government agencies. You can see that in India they rely to a large extent on genus epidemicus remedies as opposed to nosodes, and with the very large Japanese encephalitis intervention they had a mix of 3 remedies, a GE remedy, genus epidemicus remedy, a nosode, and a constitutional-based remedy. Looking at Brazil, you can see a couple of the interventions there were by private doctors, but most of the others were, certainly the larger ones, were by government agencies once again. So you can see over the three countries, we really are looking at government agencies being involved and doctors employed by government agencies being involved. Meningococcal meningitis, and this is actually strain B, which from an Australian point of view is very interesting because strain B is not covered in the regular meningococcal vaccine. Parents have to pay an extra $600 and something to get that. But yet this was the strain that was investigated or was where an intervention occurred in Brazil. And strain B is the most prevalent strain in Australia at the moment, and then dengue. And you can see where there was an ability to work out a rate of effectiveness. It ranged here from the low 80s to the mid-90s. So there's quite a degree of consistency, and when one works out an average, we can see that in those tables the effectiveness ranged between 63 and 99%, but there was a weighted average of 89.45. Now I, as part of my doctorate in the early 2000s, did a calculation where the effectiveness of homeoprophylaxis was worked out in general over all of the diseases that were in my program of 90.4%, and the 95% confidence intervals were 87.6 to 93.2. And as you can see, they're very tight around the 90.4%. And that's important because if you have confidence intervals which have a huge range, from 60% to 99%, it really is saying that, that even though there may be an average at 90, it also could be as low as 60. Well, there's an average here of 90, but the bottom reading is 87.6. So that's pretty substantial. So what we see here is that when we're looking at evidence, and these are the latest figures that I have been able to put together, that there is firstly a substantial use in literally hundreds of millions of people on an annualized basis, that the evidence suggests whilst the method is not 100% effective, nothing is against infectious diseases as a preventative, it is substantially effective, that there's an average around the 90% mark. So it means that the homeopathic option provides parents with a very reasonable option here to consider, because we know it's not toxic. We know because of the way that homeopathic medicines are prepared that the remedies, whilst occasionally, my data shows about 2% of doses will give some sort of a reaction, it's really an overstimulation of the immune system. It's not a toxic reaction because there are no molecules of the disease in the remedies. You can't get the disease from the remedies. You can't pass it on to other people. And of course, there's no aluminium, there's no formaldehyde, and many of the other things that are in vaccines. So the evidence that we have, whilst not being perfect, is consistent. It's real world evidence. And I would always take real world evidence, actual interventions, what actually happened over clinical trials, which are in many ways carefully constructed to get the best result. Well, with real world evidence, you get the result you get. And it means it's much more likely to be reproducible. And certainly the evidence that we have now, largely from government institutions around the world, supports that homeoprophylaxis can offer a very legitimate and very reasonable option to vaccination. Thank you for your time and attention. Bye-bye.